Data Center 4.0, the future of the digital ecosystem. In this podcast series from DigitalCentre, data center leader, expert and APAC-based marketeer Omer Wilson will be in conversation with technology and industry experts on the future of the data center and the wider ecosystem. Today's tech-fueled transformation era is putting traditional data centers under unprecedented pressure. This pressure is coming from businesses, users and consumers from every physical, virtual and cloud-centric angle. What does the future hold for the data center? Hello and welcome to the second in our series of DigitalCentre podcasts. This session, I'm very happy to welcome a very good friend and industry colleague, Mei-Ann Lim, who's the Executive Director of the Asia Cloud Computing Association from here in Singapore. Hey, Mei-Ann.
Hi, Omer, and thank you very much for having me here.
Great to have you. Thanks for joining us. So, Mei-Ann, on these podcasts, we're trying to look at different parts of the technology ecosystem, specifically trying to get a view on Asia. With yourself, obviously, and the association you work within, and all the different countries within Asia and South Asia you work amongst. Very keen to understand how you're seeing the adoption and growth of cloud, specifically in Southeast Asia initially, and maybe Singapore compared to the surrounding countries. To start us off.
It's a very common question I always get asked by journalists and other business people, because it's always, where's the money at, man? Where can we follow the money? And I think that it's a fantastic question. I think that a lot of the spend right now obviously will follow the trend of developing countries. So you obviously get your Singapores, your Malaysias, and Thailands, or your Asian tigers, and they're the ones who are and will be spending on data centers, on cloud computing services, etc. What's really been interesting about this spending right now is that it's been spiking in specific sectors as people have, I guess, the contagion effect of telling your friends, oh, I'm actually on cloud, I actually bought this service. And you get people who are understanding a little bit more about the value proposition of, in general, cloud and applying it. I think that we are seeing quite a lot more adoption. For example, in the financial services sector, I think in logistics sector, in the manufacturing sector, I think a lot of the I guess, early proof of concept stages have moved past the initial testing ground, and I think management and the financial officers who are controlling the money to spend on cloud, they're, I think, getting a little bit more happy. So we're seeing some of the shift, or at least some of the trends in that spending happen in specific industries.
Perfect. And I know for a lot of the sort of global and North America and European listeners, they're always very interested to understand how the dynamics are changing, I guess, around the hubs versus the non-hubs, so to speak. So obviously traditionally a lot of cloud content and infrastructure content was always in Singapore and serving the surrounding growing markets. Do you find, sort of from all the work you do and the many travels you have within the region, that shift is now really accelerating, where obviously Singapore is still hosting huge amounts of cloud infrastructure, but now really the regions, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, even sort of Vietnam, are really on that acceleration, or some markets a little bit further behind than others?
I think you'll see that the trend will continue to stay the same way. I mean, they're not called hubs for without reason. So therefore, I think the hubs will continue to lead the charge and lead the way in terms of data use, data growth, reasons for wanting to have a data center, for example. But where we're also seeing some trends is that a lot of governments right now, they themselves are building their own cloud data centers and sort of familiarizing themselves with getting down and dirty with the actual use of the data center, the actual reasons for having the data center. So we're actually seeing some of the trickle down effect happen in some of the, shall we say, auxiliary countries that we have around. And a lot of them are also seeing, hey, we actually might want to consider having some sort of data center, having it here in our country or having it nearby, etc. So I think that there are arguments for some of the smaller growth areas to pop up within the region, but definitely the hubs will continue to stay the hubs.
Understood. Makes a lot of sense. And something I think the ACCA has done a lot of great reports on this, but we see a lot of questions from our side as well on that is the SMEs, so the small to medium and the growing organizations, which obviously, if you look at, it's the same across the world, but in Asia specifically, it's a huge tail, which is really driving new growth, be it China, be it South Asia, India, massive consumer power.
Yeah, absolutely.
How are they, and you've done so many good reports, so those findings would be really interesting, I think, to the listeners. What sort of trends are they on in terms of cloud adoption? Are they doing it much faster, obviously, given their size? Is it harder in some locations than others? Or?
Well, SMEs are, talking about SMEs, it's like talking about Asia in general, that you assume that they're heterogeneous in nature. And it's really difficult to do that because, even a market like, for example, Singapore, you can't really just talk about the Singapore market. You actually have to talk about the segmentation within the market. So it's the same with SMEs. Like, what exactly do you want to talk about? Which industry are they focused on? You need to understand the industry, and then you need to understand the size of the industry, because for SMEs you have the really, really micro SMEs, which are 1 or 2 people to 5 people, and then you have the next stage of growth, which is probably 5 to 10 people, and we all know that SMEs have a growth pain point at 10 people to 20 people. That's a really hard sort of shift to move into. So you not only have to understand the definition of where the industry is for that SME, but you also have to understand the size of the SME. And that's probably what's driving a lot of frustration and a lot of the work that people want to do on SME but can't quite get a handle on it, because a lot of effort has to be put in to understand where they are and their business model. SMEs don't spend money to save money, which is where a lot of the traditional cloud computing companies tend to make their pitch. Hi, come onto cloud computing because there's so much cost efficiencies. SMEs don't spend money to save money. SMEs spend money to make money. And that's a really important differentiation, because once you go in there with a sales mindset, you actually have to understand their business model and say, hey, if you move on to cloud, if you get our cloud product, you will actually be able to do far more than you were actually able to do prior to moving on to cloud. So that's really a frustration point, because it actually requires your sales guys and your sales pitch to actually change 180 degrees into here's what you can do. And a lot of people, maybe they're used to the easy old days of 5-10 years ago, where people were sort of saying, okay, we'll be able to spend X amount of money on cloud, and it was an easy purchase because these are all big enterprises. But with small and medium enterprises, that's not going to come so easy. So a lot of more hard work is going to be needed, I feel, and in the first instance, to understand the industry of the SME, and then to understand the business model of that particular SME sector that you're moving into. Does that make sense?
It does, a lot. I think you're absolutely right. It's sort of we get the generic term of doing business in Asia, sometimes from our sort of non-Asia based colleagues, and similarly SME is sort of looked on as one group.
Yeah, and
this it's very unique.
Yeah, and this doesn't even take into account the differences within each country and the region. North Vietnam, for example, very different from southern Vietnam. If you go into Cambodia, it's very different from the metropolis and the outlying cities. Thailand as well, which is obviously a major, one of the growth areas, and Indonesia as well. There are many, many regions, and it's not simply just one country. I mean, it's nice to aggregate, and it's very nice to just be lazy and to say, Thailand in general and Asia in general. But man, it's so heterogeneous that it's really a problem. Add that to the complexities of the small and medium enterprises, and you have a pretty, shall we say, harder road to plow, I think.
Complex, that's for sure. So tied to that again, I think, which is from ACCA's work, a little bit tied to SMEs, but by the market. So what have you seen from a government enabling cloud adoption perspective? Any good examples you can share from within Southeast Asia? I know one from my perspective to throw out there, which is talked about a lot, is obviously in Singapore, the monetary authority around cloud usage by banks and the regulations. A few years back now, but we saw that before that banks were still moving to the cloud, but so you had concerns and issues, and after that it's become a pretty much a standard in the region for people to follow. So you can elaborate on that one, but also any other examples where you said, as you go to different governments and work with different associations, that's a really nice approach for enabling cloud in that country.
We've had incremental gains when it comes to governments talking about moving on to cloud, because there are two aspects to that. Number one is the government themselves moving on to cloud. So it's the gov cloud and the use of cloud computing in providing citizen services, and that's a major part usually of an e-government strategy. So let me park that for the moment. Let me talk about what you're talking about, which is the second part, which is enabling cloud use for the private sector. And we're seeing that in general, most governments don't really have an opinion about this. A lot of the financial regulators, which have been right at the forefront of this battle or of understanding where cloud sits in the private sector, have been always generally taking a risk-based approach to it. So they're trying to be as technologically neutral as possible. I think that earlier on, maybe 5 years ago, they started actually talking about maybe we should have a cloud regulations, but a lot of times now it's moved on to, okay, let's just think about it like any other technology, and let's assess the risks and how we can manage the risks. Now, does this mean that people now, the financial regulators now have to go in and update their outsourcing guidelines, their IT risk management guidelines? I think the answer is yes. A lot of times this is where I wouldn't say fear, but I think some anxiety grips the regulator, because sometimes they don't actually have this risk management guidelines in a neatly packaged up manner. Because of legacy regulations, they may actually exist in perhaps an IT use law, an IT use regulation. And they'll need to do therefore two things. They'll need to first come up with the new regulation around, for example, IT risk management, and then repeal that particular section in that old law, which is actually, it will take a lot of time, especially with the election cycle coming up in a couple of countries, and this is really problematic. But the nice thing about us at the ACCA is that we've seen these incremental gains, and we're actually seeing a lot of it now take traction as the, I guess, early adopters who struggled with the technology use and application of it within the business sector. These government agencies are actually seeing, okay, there's a way forward. There is light at the end of the tunnel. There are now best practices around things like managing cloud, managing the risk of cloud. How do you deal with the usual FAQs that you get from the industry? And we're seeing a lot of the, shall we say, laggard countries also now seeing, okay, actually now the leaders have done it, we can actually, I guess, copy their homework and we can get it done a little bit more in a faster. So I'm anticipating that this regulatory challenge will get accelerated a lot in the next 3 to 5 years. So I'm really looking forward to having this discussion with a lot more of the regulators, especially the financial regulators.
And tied to staying with government, and I'm sure it's, if you asked anybody from our listeners group, one of the largest questions or thoughts would be around data sovereignty. And obviously what's happening in different countries. We have the Indonesian financial data within the country, and that was held and then sort of semi moved forward again and sort of held. But how's that trend developing in South Asia specifically? Is that now, we're seeing it in different countries across the world, but is it sort of still generally on hold, watch and see, or are you seeing countries now really push forward around this whole data sovereignty, keeping data within their borders?
I would still say that we're in a little bit of an exploratory stage when it comes to exploring what exactly do we mean by data sovereignty. Because in my discussions with a lot of the governments, there is a conflation between national security, cyber security, and what usually needs to be basically record keeping, which, for audit purposes needs to be held within country, etc. Yeah. Then there is the business recovery in case of a disaster, and then you obviously have the mirror centers where you have redundancy built in. So there are a lot of things to be unpacked, and different governments, when they use the term national sovereignty, data sovereignty, they actually have a different motivation behind it. Add this to the complexity of understanding what is the difference between cybersecurity and data security and data privacy, and you have this this Pandora's box of motivations that you actually have to unpack before you actually see what the concerns are. So in the case of something like a place like Indonesia, you actually have to see who's actually asking for that regulation to be put in place, because sometimes it's actually a copy paste of, again, an audit requirement that simply required the records to be kept within the country, in which case perhaps an alternative approach towards data management can be taken. For example, one of the things which I know that the Indonesian government is working on is a data classification mechanism by which you can say, okay, certain data is like super duper confidential and does need to be held within the country, and this is usually tied with the national security requirements. And then you have other things which are like, okay, well, these are just, record keeping for the sake of record keeping, because we just want to make sure that we have 7 years of records. And if that's the case, then well, it's kind of not really necessary to absolutely have it be in the country. So in that sense, where does that national sovereignty, where does data sovereignty therefore rear its head and say, no, this is an absolute must? Because let's face it, if you were a government, if you were a company, if you were a business and you needed to keep all of your data in one place at one time, that centralizes your risk, and that's really problematic, and also increases your cost exponentially, which kind of then throws out the whole idea of cloud computing being a cost-efficient way of managing your data. So it doesn't really make a lot of sense. So that's where we're seeing some of the discussions go along. And the problem right now is that we're seeing that different government agencies are at different parts of this conversational spectrum when it comes to understanding what they mean when they say data sovereignty. And a lot of times they themselves don't know. They just say, well, actually, I saw my neighbor. It's like keeping up with the Joneses, right? My neighbor, they had data sovereignty as well. I think I want to keep my data in the country as well. But why? Because we think it's good. That's okay. Then you can't actually dig at the motivations, because people are complex. So the motivations behind the desire for data sovereignty do need to get dug up. They do need to get exposed, and that's where I think an organization like the ACCA is important, because we try to surface this, hopefully in a non-confrontational manner, and make sure that they understand what they're asking for when they say we want data sovereignty.
Yeah, it makes a lot of sense. I think your point on data classification is really interesting, because from an infrastructure, so coming from the data center world, we're seeing similar in terms of a lot of questions getting asked by the various governments and markets we operate in. What do your customers, our customers, have within your facilities? Specifically around, is it the core compute parts of the business, or is it more backup? Because as you know, there's a lot of decisions being made now around how much data centers can nearly all markets consume in terms of energy, and that comes back to data classification, that idea about do you keep all your data in one place because it's national sovereignty, or only the data that matters, which is again a classification, and then it ties to storage and where does that data sit. So that's very interesting as well.
Yeah, and it's not an easy process actually to make sure that the government agencies actually understand the concept of data classification, because this actually really means a re-engineering of how you actually manage your data records. And a lot of times, my mom's a government civil servant, so I've seen some of the data that she stores. I'm not quite sure you want to be digging through that, and they're very reluctant to do it. And some people are like, I'm 2 months from retirement, why am I doing all of this arrangement and rearrangement of all my files, let the other person do it? So it's a very human problem, and it's a very intractable problem, because you're dealing with legacy systems of thinking and people, and it's always a little bit painful when you have to dig into that.
So as we draw to the close, I think we can't do any technology podcast in this day and age without talking about artificial intelligence. So I'm going to throw that into the mix. When it comes to all of the topics we've spoken about, I want to get ACCA's view, or any recent activities or your thoughts really around AI, what you've seen, which areas or markets are more advanced. Singapore's doing a lot around AI, but specifically in terms of the Cloud Association and then data. What do you see in at least the short term? So by short, next few years, let's say, the potential impact of AI as it gets more and more engaged within not just private sector organisations, but governments start being able to use this huge computing power that it is going to bring.
So I feel that the discussion for the ACCA for AI is almost like a rehash of what we moved into when we were starting to talk about data lakes, about not data leaks, but data lakes, where you have a whole bunch of data and you just dump it there, and then you're thinking, okay, well, what can we possibly do with this? And that's the question that I feel AI and specifically machine learning is going to be asking, because you can run an algorithm, you can run an AI, and it will have an algorithm inside, and that's the way that it, inverted commas, it thinks. But if you let it loose on a data lake, on a data set, and you're not going to be able to really predict what's going to come out, because you never know what kind of data is going to get massaged out. It's like, in my old statistics class, we used to run all manner of regression analysis on column A versus column C, and then you end up with a weird statement like, eating more McDonald's makes you run faster or something like that, because that's what the data tells you. And I feel that conversation for the ACCA is going to be within the realm of how much data do you store? What kind of data lake are you going to let the AI loose into? And obviously, where are you going to store that huge amount of data that you're going to start playing around with? So leaving aside the very, very controversial chunk of discussion around data privacy and whether or not people actually have given their consent for all of that information to be run, think about it in terms of non-personally identifiable information. Let's say you have run a logistics factory and you're sitting on 20 years worth of records of shipping things in and out throughout the world. Now that's completely not personally identifiable information, nor personally tagged information. It's just like boxes being moved here and there, and your goods. And you want to be releasing an AI onto all of that data. But in the first instance, how much data do you have? Do you have the questions to ask the data? If not, it's really going to be garbage in, garbage out. And that's going to be a very interesting discussion for us, because it really means going and digging down into the mechanics of what exactly are you trying to find out when you're trying to get insights from this data. Because a lot of people don't realize this. You have to be very targeted when you ask questions of data. Because if you don't, you're going to get data which makes no sense. And that's one of the areas which I think ACCA is going to start weaving into. Prior to that, we probably need to start defining where the limits of AI and machine learning are, because just because it's a calculator doesn't mean that I would call a calculator AI. I mean, I'm just lazy because I don't want to multiply by myself. That's why I use this AI thing called a calculator. But defining where and what the categories of AI are going to be pretty important, I think.
So final question, and then I'll ask you for any thoughts you want to partake from ACCA to close the podcast. But as we're obviously Singapore based, and our regional HQ of Digital Realty is here, we've got a very proud and long history in Singapore, and we've seen it develop. So-called battle of the hubs in terms of data centers. It's really taken a leap in Asia over the last few years for various factors, and the future is definitely strong, despite various headwinds which aren't unique to Singapore, which is we see the same in Amsterdam, in fact, and other markets around. How governments are managing energy usage in this very not easy climate period around carbon targets, and all markets are facing that. But specifically from your perspective, I wanted to ask, because you've got a really interesting view of seeing Singapore, then seeing this region, seeing India, seeing the rest of Asia through your work, what do you think, if you had to say sort of one or two things Singapore needs to do just to make sure it definitely gets right to remain, not just in the next few years, but 5 years to a decade, keep that position? Because it's getting harder, it's getting very competitive with other markets. But if you had to say, one or two things that it does very well today that it needs to keep doing, or maybe some new things that you think to remain as that key South Asian hub.
I think definitely it's the value add. we definitely, as a hub, and I say we because I'm Singaporean with my Singaporean flag here, we as a hub, I think we have always been early adopters and early providers of technology services to people. So in terms of the data center build, etc. I mean, I'm glad that we definitely got into that game really, really early on, and we have definitely established a core group of people who are very familiar with the use of things like data centers and the advanced technology that it has. But we're not a very land-rich country, as you can imagine, and land is massively expensive here. So we definitely, absolutely cannot compete on land prices. So therefore, if that's considered the lower end of the market, then we'll have to let that one go. One thing which I think Singapore definitely needs is to compete on the value-added services. We've just finished discussing AI, for example. We'll need to start and making sure that we have the right talent in the country that can actually crunch the numbers and the data. So that's almost independent of whether or not we can support the infrastructure here, but can we support the human capital here? That's really, really core. And that and other deep technologies, for example, we've got the med tech, the R&D sections, the AI and machine learning sections, all of that type of deep tech. I think we're going to have to start moving into and building up bases, centers of excellence, centers of knowledge where we can train people and make sure that we're pushing out R&D here, that we can actually drive that demand from a central hub in Singapore. I think that's really, really core. Because there is no way that we can possibly compete with anywhere else like India or Indonesia or Thailand for just the space to build data centers. But the expertise and the training, I think that's core.
I would fully agree with that. Man, always such a pleasure to speak with you. Anything you want to leave the listeners with from yourself, ACCA? Perspective?
Well, I'd like to ask you, what do you think about the outlook for data centers and cloud computing for at least the next 2 years? I know that we've seen quite a lot of uptake from the developed countries as well, but I'm not sure how much you see from in exploratory fashion from the developing countries. Are you seeing any sort of interest there, or is it more like this market is way too small and we're gonna see them having to develop the data centers and data demand markets by themselves?
Sure. No, I think from a demand perspective, obviously we work with most, if not all, of the large cloud providers globally, both global and in region, and it's safe to say Singapore demand is as strong as it's ever been. And other markets, Singapore is still taking that edge, but speaking in the current political climate, even Hong Kong demand is strong. So that gives you a feel for how a technology is a like water, like electricity. People just need it to do business now. So
I just think that the Singaporean mindset and the Singaporean ethos of kiasuism has infected the entire world. Okay, the data center and the data industry right now is just driven by this idea of kiasuism. We just don't want to lose any data. People are just storing data and keeping data, and they're not letting anything go. So I think that no matter what it is, it's just going to keep growing because that more, like I said, more and more people just want to keep the information where they are.
It's a human right. I think there's a few politicians that said, access to the internet is now, I think it was at the UN, even,
yes.
They said it's like access to water.
Yeah.
So it's a basic human right, and that's where it's going. But back to the hub versus the region, that's definitely accelerating. There's no two ways about it. And certain markets, I think, obvious ones, India. With Mumbai, let alone the other areas, but Mumbai especially, in Indonesia, Jakarta, huge pent-up demand, so to speak. And then the other markets, I think for the sort of mid to the longer term, like the Vietnams, Thailand, Malaysia, I think are not too far behind those.
I think the demand from India is going to be really interesting, and the demand from Indonesia as well, because they're big enough countries that they have different states available, and therefore I think that different states are actually going to drive different types of demand. And I think that you can definitely speak to this because, you know, for India, I think that you can see that there are really different markets coming up from different states, really. Indonesia is interesting because they just announced that they're moving the capital. I mean, for the 9th time, yes, they're going to move the capital. But then, okay, this time maybe it's really going to happen, and maybe, you know, there's going to be that if they really do move the capital, that's a huge area of development that's going to need, you know, creating. Exactly. So I think that, you know, I mean, I don't know whether some people think that, you know, Asia is a little bit of a boring or, you know, just constantly developing market, but I always find it really fascinating because it's so heterogeneous, and that's what makes it both difficult as well as interesting.
I would agree with that. Well, thank you so much for your time.
You're very welcome.
Really appreciate it.
One last note to people listening is that obviously we're releasing the Cloud Readiness Index really, really soon. So that's coming up on our website really soon. So have a quick look out for it.
And we will we'll share it on DigitalCentre as well.
Thank you.
As ACCA is a core steering committee member. So thanks again to Mayan Lim, Executive Director of the Asia Cloud Computing Association. Please do listen and look out for further notices as we move forward, and we'll let you know soon for the next in our series of DigitalCentre podcasts. Thank you very much.